He was the shadow over Seoul, until a woman who hated everything he stood for became the only thing he wanted to protect. Adrian Volkov was a ghost in the city, cold, untouchable, and lethal. In the high-rise boardrooms and the darkest alleys, his name was a warning. He viewed the world as a series of cold calculations. People were pieces to be moved, and mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. He didn't do vulnerability. He didn't do normal. And he certainly didn't believe in the law. To Adrian, power was the only truth, and feelings were the rust that destroyed a man's edge. The change began with a single, irritating vibration of his phone. It was his childhood friend, Minjun, begging for a 10-minute favor, take his place on a blind date he was too terrified to attend. Adrian almost hung up, his mind already back on a multi-million-dollar shipment, but a rare moment of obligation won out. 10 minutes. A quick appearance, a polite exit, and then back to the shadows. He arrived at a quiet university cafe, the smell of old books and espresso universe away from his usual haunts. But the moment he stepped inside, the air in his lungs tightened. Sitting by the window was a young black woman, her braided hair catching the soft light. She wasn't scrolling on a phone. She was leaning forward, a book titled Justice resting on the table like a shield. She looked fearless, her eyes scanning the room with the intensity of someone ready to change the world. Her name was Maya. As their gazes locked, the ice Adrian had spent a lifetime building around his heart developed a hairline fracture. For the first time, he didn't feel like a boss or a devil, he felt seen. "Hi," she said, her voice serious and steady. "You must be Daniel." The lie was right there. He should have walked away. He should have told her Daniel wasn't coming. Instead, he pulled out the chair and sat down. 10 minutes, he promised himself. But as Maya leaned in to challenge the very foundations of his world, Adrian realized those 10 minutes were the end of the man he used to be. The air inside the quiet cafe near the university smelled of roasted beans and old paper, a sharp contrast to the cold, metallic scent of the world Adrian Volkov usually inhabited. He adjusted his dark coat, feeling out of place without the usual wall of guards surrounding him. He was the Devil of Seoul, a man who ran his empire like a calculated chess game where feelings were nothing but a dangerous weakness. Yet here he was, doing a 10-minute favor for his childhood friend, Minjun. When he stepped inside, the soft ring of the bell felt like a warning. By the window sat a girl whose skin seemed to glow under the warm lights. She held a notebook titled Justice tightly against her chest, her expression a mix of nerves and fierce determination. This was Maya. As their eyes met, Adrian felt a strange internal shift, a warmth that had no place in his cold, strategic life. "Hi, you must be Daniel," she said with a shy, hopeful smile. Adrian knew he should correct her. He should tell her that Daniel didn't exist, that the man standing before her was a shadow leader whispered about in dark alleys. Instead, he heard himself say yes as he took the seat across from her. He promised himself it would only be 10 minutes. Maya talked fast when she was nervous, her passion for international law spilling out in every sentence. She spoke of fighting corruption and protecting those who were invisible to the system. "I want to make the world fair," she insisted, her eyes shining with a light Adrian hadn't seen in years. Adrian almost laughed at the naivety. In his world, the world was never fair. It was simply a collection of power moves and calculated risks. "And how will you do that?" he asked, his voice smooth and calm. Maya leaned forward, her gaze locking onto his with terrifying intensity. "By standing up to powerful men who think they are above the law," she said firmly. The words hit Adrian like a quiet, physical slap. She was talking about men exactly like him, yet she had no idea who was actually sitting across from her. When she asked what he did for a living, he offered a curated version of the truth. "I manage businesses," he replied, omitting the violence and the shadows that maintained them. Throughout the hour, Maya challenged every cynical idea he possessed. When he claimed the world ran on power, she shook her head without a hint of fear. "No," she countered, "the world runs on choices." No one had ever dared to disagree with him like this, yet her defiance felt more intoxicating than the control he usually exerted over others. 10 minutes turned into 20, then an hour. When he finally stood to leave, the cold night air felt different. His heart was beating with a frantic rhythm he couldn't control. He knew his enemies were watching, waiting for a single sign of weakness, and yet all he could see was the girl by the window who wanted to destroy men like him. The deception had begun, but as he drove away, Adrian realized he was no longer the one in control of the game. The heavy glass doors of the Volkov Group headquarters closed behind Adrian with a finality that echoed through the marble lobby. Usually, this silence was a testament to his power, a quiet born of fear, where employees held their breath until he passed. Tonight, however, the silence felt hollow. He climbed the stairs to the executive floor, the image of Maya's ink-stained fingers and her unwavering belief in choices playing on a loop in his mind. In his private office, 3 men in sharp, tailored suits waited. These were his architects of shadow, the financial advisors who kept the blood off the ledgers and the profits hidden in a web of offshore accounts. "The acquisition of the pier is ready, sir," the lead advisor said, sliding a thick folder across the mahogany desk. "Once we force the local unions out, the revenue stream will be untraceable. It's a perfect move." Adrian didn't look at the folder. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the flickering lights of Seoul. Somewhere out there, in a cramped dorm or a late-night library, Maya was likely studying her justice notebook, believing that the world could be better. "Cancel it," Adrian said, his voice a low gravel. The room went cold. The advisors exchanged frantic glances. "Sir, the unions are already intimidated. We've invested months." "I said cancel it," Adrian turned, his eyes piercing. "And I want a full audit of every subsidiary we own. Anything that touches the black market, anything that relies on intimidation as a business model, I want it liquidated or restructured, immediately." "That will cost billions," the advisor stammered, his face paling. "The transition alone, the board, the other families, they'll see this as a surrender. They'll think you've gone soft. You'll lose the fear you've spent a decade building." Adrian adjusted his cufflink, the gold glinting in the dim light. "Let them think I'm soft. I'm tired of running a kingdom of ghosts. From now on, we move into tech, green energy, and infrastructure, fully transparent, fully legal." But why now? Adrian thought of the way Maya had looked at him, not as a monster to be avoided, but as Daniel, a man who listened. If she ever saw the truth of his ledgers, that light in her eyes would extinguish, replaced by the very hatred she had described in the cafe. He realized then that he no longer wanted to be the man people looked down to avoid. He wanted to be a man she could look up to. "Because the world runs on choices," Adrian said, echoing her words with a bittersweet smile. "And I'm tired of making the wrong ones." As the advisors scrambled to follow his impossible orders, Adrian sat at his desk and pulled out a simple burner phone. He didn't call his captains or his enforcers. Instead, he typed a short message to the number Maya had given him. "I enjoyed our talk tonight. I'd like to hear more about those choices of yours." He knew that by dismantling his empire, he was painting a target on his back. His rivals would see a weakness. His allies would see a betrayal. But as the sent notification flickered on his screen, the weight that had sat on his chest for years finally began to lift. He was stepping out of the shadows, even if the light was bound to burn. The afternoon sun draped the university courtyard in a deceptive gold, but for Adrian, the air felt heavy with the scent of an impending storm. He had spent the last week living a double life, spending his mornings dismantling a criminal empire and his evenings wandering through city parks with Maya, playing the part of Daniel. With her, he was just a man who liked black coffee and listened to her theories on social reform. But the two worlds were never meant to collide. The transition of his assets had sparked a fire in the underworld. His rivals, sensing the Devil of Seoul was weakening his grip, had begun to circle. For the first time in years, Adrian's security team refused to stay in the shadows. "Sir, the threat from the Kang Syndicate is verified. You cannot walk this campus alone," his head of security, Jace, insisted as they stepped out of a black armored sedan near the law library. Adrian adjusted his glasses, his heart sinking. He had planned to meet Maya by the fountain to give her a rare first edition of a legal text he'd found. He was surrounded by 6 men in tactical suits, their earpieces glinting and their postures rigid with lethal intent. The luxury car sat idling behind them, a flag of wealth and violence that he could no longer hide. Then he saw her. Maya was walking down the library stone steps, laughing at something on her phone. She looked up, her smile wide and bright, until it froze. Her eyes traveled from the expensive, custom-made suit Adrian wore to the wall of stone-faced guards flanking him, and finally to the black sedan that blocked the pedestrian path. The silence that followed was deafening. The students nearby scattered, sensing the dangerous aura of the men surrounding Adrian. Maya's justice notebook was tucked under her arm, but as she took a step toward him, her hand trembled. "Daniel," she whispered, the name sounding like a plea. Adrian felt a sharp, twisting pain in his chest. He wanted to reach out to tell Jace to stand down, but he knew it was too late. The illusion was shattered. "Maya," he started, his voice losing its Daniel softness and returning to the low, commanding gravel of the Volkov patriarch. "Who are these people?" she asked, her voice gaining a hard, sharp edge. She looked at the tattoos peeking from beneath his crisp white collar, marks of a lineage she had spent her life studying in criminal law textbooks. Her eyes moved to Jace, who was scanning the rooftops with a hand resting near his holster. Her face went pale, then flush with a sudden, burning fury. "You're not a business manager, you're him, you're Volkov." "I can explain," Adrian said, stepping forward. Immediately, his guards shifted to form a perimeter, instinctively treating Maya as a potential variable. "Don't," she snapped, recoiling as if his very presence was a physical weight. "I spent all night talking to you about men who think they are gods, about men who build their lives on the backs of people they've broken, and all that time you were just mocking me." "I wasn't mocking you," Adrian said desperately, ignoring the confused glances of his men. "Everything I told you, everything I felt, that was real." "Real," Maya laughed, a cold, broken sound. She looked at the armored car and the men ready to kill on his command. "This is your reality, Adrian. My world is about the law. Yours is about being above it. Don't ever call me again." She turned and walked away, her pace fast and her head held high, though he could see her shoulders shaking. Adrian stood paralyzed, the Devil of Seoul surrounded by his legion, realizing that in gaining his empire back for a moment of safety, he had lost the only world he actually wanted to live in. The orange glow of the horizon was not the sunrise, but the incinerated remains of Adrian's largest logistics hub on the Han River. Standing on the cooling asphalt of the perimeter, Adrian watched the black smoke coil into the sky. The air was thick with the scent of burnt rubber and industrial chemicals. Beside him, Jace was a statue of barely contained fury, his phone buzzing incessantly with reports from their enforcers. It was Kang's men. "They didn't even try to hide it," Jace said, his voice trembling with the need for action. "They're waiting for the retaliation, sir. The men are armed. We know exactly which of Kang's clubs to hit first. If we don't strike back by morning, every small-time gang in Seoul will think the Volkov lion has lost its teeth." Adrian didn't answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. There were no new messages from Maya. The silence from her was louder than the roar of the fire had been. He thought of her words from the cafe, how the world was built on the choice to do what was right instead of what was easy. Retaliation was easy. It was the language he had spoken his entire life. He could feel the old instinct rising, the cold, calculated urge to erase Kang from the map. "Sir," Jace pressed, stepping closer. "The order, we're losing time." Adrian looked at the devastation. This warehouse had been one of the first assets he had ordered to be audited for legal transition. Kang hadn't just attacked his property, he had attacked Adrian's bridge to a clean life. "Tell the men to stand down," Adrian said quietly. Jace froze. "I'm sorry, I must have misheard you." "You didn't," Adrian turned, his eyes tired but resolute. "We are not hitting back. Document the damage. Hand every piece of security footage, every shell casing, and every witness statement over to the Seoul Metropolitan Police. Use our legal consultants to ensure the file is impossible to ignore." "To the police?" Jace looked at him as if he were speaking a foreign tongue. "We don't go to the police. We handle our own blood." "Not anymore," Adrian said. "If I meet violence with violence, I'm just proving Maya right. I'm just another man who thinks he's above the law because he has the power to be." I told her I wanted to be different. This is what different looks like. Kang will think you're weak, Jace warned. Let him, Adrian replied, walking toward his car. Weakness is following an old pattern because you're afraid to break it. Strength is choosing to be the man she believes I can be, even when the world is burning down around me. As the black sedan pulled away from the ruins, Adrian looked at his reflection in the window. The Devil of Seoul was fading, replaced by a man who was willing to lose an empire to find his soul. He didn't know if Maya would ever forgive him, or if she would ever see this sacrifice. But as he drove into the gray morning light, the silence in his heart finally felt peaceful. He had made his choice. The morning light in Seoul felt unusually piercing as Adrian stood backstage at the National Press Center. He adjusted his tie, not in a darkened boardroom, but in a room filled with flashbulbs and journalists. For a man who had spent his life ensuring his name was never printed in a newspaper, the vulnerability was staggering. He could feel the weight of the Devil of Seoul slewing off, leaving behind a man who felt dangerously exposed. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Jace whispered, hovering near the curtain. "Once you step out there, there is no going back to the shadows. Every prosecutor, every rival, and every citizen will have a target on you." Adrian looked at his phone one last time. Still no messages from Maya. He didn't expect one, but he needed her to see this. He needed her to know that his choice wasn't a temporary performance. It was a total surrender of the power she loathed. The shadows were a cage, Jace. It's time to open the door. He stepped onto the podium. The wall of camera flashes was blinding, a digital fire that didn't burn but stripped him bare. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying the same steady gravel that had once commanded underground syndicates, but now it was channeled into a different purpose. "For too long," Adrian began, his gaze fixed on a camera lens as if he were looking directly into Maya's eyes. "The Volkov group has operated in the periphery of the law. Today, that ends. I am announcing a total restructuring of our holdings. We are liquidating all non-transparent assets and pivoting entirely toward public infrastructure and legal technology." The room erupted in a murmur of shock. Reporters shouted questions, their voices a chaotic tide. "Is this a stunt? Are you afraid of the current investigations? What about the Kang Syndicate?" Adrian raised a hand and the room fell into an expectant silence. "This is not a strategic retreat. It is a choice. I have spent my life believing that power was the only thing that mattered, but I have learned that true strength is the courage to be accountable. We are submitting every ledger, every contract, and every historical record to a third-party legal audit led by the university's oversight committee." He knew the risks. By handing over the records, he was inviting the law to scrutinize his past. But he also knew that Maya would be following the news. She would see the Volkov name, the name she equated with corruption, attached to words like transparency and reform. He was trading his invincibility for a chance at her respect. As he walked off the stage, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a quiet, steady peace. He hadn't just announced a business change. He had declared his intent to be the man Maya believed he could be. He walked past Jace and into the waiting car, no longer an armored fortress but a simple sedan. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his breath catching. It was a news notification from the university blog, sharing a clip of his speech. Below it, in the comments section that was usually filled with student cynicism, was a single, anonymous heart emoji. He couldn't be sure it was her, but for the first time since the Daniel mask had fallen, Adrian felt like he was finally standing in the light. He had traded the fear of a city for the hope of a single girl, and as the car moved through the bright streets of Seoul, he knew it was the best trade he had ever made. The air in the small, sun-drenched apartment smelled of rosemary and home, a scent that felt entirely foreign to Adrian's world of sterile offices and cold leather. He sat stiffly on the edge of a modest velvet sofa, his large frame making the room feel smaller. Opposite him sat Mrs. Johnson. She didn't have a security detail or a legal team, yet her gaze was more piercing than any prosecutor Adrian had ever faced. She was the woman who had raised Maya to believe in justice, and she was the ultimate judge of his transformation. Maya stood by the kitchenette, her hands hovering nervously over a teapot. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant hum of Seoul's traffic. "I saw you on the news, Mr. Volkov," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice calm but heavy with the weight of experience. "A man like you doesn't just wake up and decide to be a saint. In my experience, men with that much power usually only give it up when they're forced to, or when they're hiding something even bigger." Adrian met her eyes directly. He didn't use his Daniel smile or his Volkov authority. "I wasn't forced, Mrs. Johnson. I was shown a mirror. Your daughter looked at me and didn't see a king or a devil. She saw a man who was making the wrong choices. I'm trying to prove she was right to see him." Mrs. Johnson leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "Maya is a flame. She wants to change the world, to speak for the people the law forgets. A man with your history, your shadows have a way of catching up. I've seen powerful men marry bright women only to turn them into trophies. They dim their light to keep themselves safe. Tell me, if her career ever puts your new legal interests at risk, would you ask her to be quiet?" The question hung in the air, a sharp test of his soul. Adrian thought about the many times he had silenced opposition with a single word. He thought about how easy it would be to protect Maya by keeping her small, away from the dangers of his past. "I didn't fall in love with a trophy," Adrian said, his voice low and steady. "I fell in love with a woman who had the courage to tell me the truth when no one else would. Maya's voice is the reason I'm standing in the light. If the day comes where her pursuit of justice crosses my path, I won't ask her to stop. I'll step aside. My power was a cage, but her dreams are a compass. I would rather be a man she respects than a man she fears." Maya walked over, placing the tea tray on the table. She looked at her mother, then at Adrian, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and pride. Mrs. Johnson watched them for a long moment, the tension in her shoulders finally beginning to ebb. She reached out and took a sip of her tea, her expression softening. "You're a dangerous man, Adrian," she said quietly, "but I think you're also a man who is tired of being alone in the dark. Don't let your past become her burden." "I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring it doesn't," Adrian replied. As the afternoon light faded, the conversation shifted from an interrogation to a bridge. For the first time, Adrian wasn't negotiating a contract or a peace treaty. He was earning a place in a family. He realized then that while his public reforms had convinced the city, this quiet room was where he had truly begun to earn his redemption. The departure lounge at Incheon International Airport was bathed in a sterile, clinical light that felt at odds with the heavy warmth in Adrian's chest. For years, airports had been places of tactical arrivals and hurried escapes for him, but today, the terminal felt like the edge of a cliff. Maya stood before him, her suitcase pulled tight to her side, and a boarding pass tucked into the cover of a new journal, one he had given her, embossed with the scales of justice. The 6-month residency in London was the opportunity of a lifetime, a chance for her to work with an international human rights firm. It was everything she had fought for, and yet, as the overhead speakers announced the final call for her flight, her resolve seemed to flicker. "I feel like I'm leaving you in the middle of a storm," she whispered, looking at the headline on a nearby newsstand that still bore his name and the word audit. "Your rivals, the transition, it's a lot to handle without a friend." Adrian reached out, taking her hands in his. His touch was no longer the calculated grip of a boss. It was the steady anchor of a man who had found his center. "The storm is mine to weather, Maya. You gave me the map to get out of the dark. Now you have to go and build the world you told me about in that cafe." 6 months is a long time, Adrian," she said, her voice small. "The distance, it changes people. What if we grow into different versions of ourselves?" Adrian leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of her cocoa butter and travel-weary perfume was something he wanted to memorize, a shield against the lonely months ahead. "Then we will fall in love with those versions, too," he promised, his voice a low, resolute vibration. "Distance isn't a wall, Maya, it's a refinery. It's going to burn away the last of the Daniel deception and the Volkov shadow, leaving only what's real between us. I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here, making sure the man you come back to is someone you can be proud of." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears but anchored by the same fierce conviction that had first captivated him. "You're already that man, Adrian." She stood on her tiptoes, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to his cheek before pulling away. As she walked toward the security gate, she turned back one last time and flashed a small, brave smile. Adrian stayed until her silhouette disappeared into the crowd, standing long after the gate had closed. He walked back to his car. No sirens, no motorcade, just a man alone with his thoughts. The silence of the drive back to the city didn't feel empty. It felt like a countdown. He had a kingdom to dismantle and a life to build, and for the first time, the passage of time wasn't something to be feared. It was a bridge to the person he was becoming for her. The silence of Adrian's penthouse was no longer filled with the cold clinking of ice in a glass or the hushed reports of subordinates. Instead, it was filled with the rhythmic, digital chime of an incoming video call. It was 3:00 a.m. in Seoul and 6:00 p.m. in London. Adrian sat at his desk, the city skyline sprawling behind him, but his entire world was concentrated on the small glowing screen of his tablet. When Maya's face appeared, the exhaustion of his day, filled with grueling legal depositions and the slow, painful dismantling of his old security protocols, seemed to vanish. She was sitting in a crowded London cafe, a scarf wrapped around her neck, and a stack of case files spread before her. "You look tired, Daniel," she said, using the name with a playful, lingering warmth that reminded him of their first night. "It's Adrian now, remember," he countered with a soft smile. "And being honest is a lot more exhausting than being feared. There are more forms to sign." They laughed, a sound that bridged the thousands of miles between them. Over the next few months, these digital windows became their sanctuary. They didn't just talk about their days. They built a foundation of transparency that their first meeting had lacked. Maya shared her frustrations with international bureaucracy and her small victories in the courtroom. Adrian, in turn, was vulnerable in a way he had never been. He told her about the struggle of letting go of control, the fear of the power vacuum he was creating, and the strange, quiet peace of waking up without a weapon under his pillow. There were moments of tension, too. When a remnant of the Kang syndicate attempted to leak old, fabricated documents to discredit his reform, Maya didn't pull away. She stayed on the call for 4 hours, walking him through the legal ramifications and reminding him that his truth was his strongest shield. "Trust isn't just about not lying," she told him one rainy evening, her face illuminated by the soft light of her London flat. "It's about growing in the same direction, even when you aren't walking side by side." Adrian realized then that their relationship was no longer a chase or a deception. It was a partnership. He wasn't just changing for her anymore. He was changing because her belief in him had given him the courage to believe in himself. He watched her grow more confident, her voice gaining a sharp, professional edge as she navigated the legal world, while he felt himself softening, his edges rounding into a man who valued conversation over command. By the 5th month, the distance felt less like a void and more like a forge. Every call was a brick in the bridge they were building toward a shared future. They planned for the day she would land in Seoul, not as a student and a devil, but as two equals who had survived the fire of their own pasts. As he hung up the call that night, Adrian looked at his reflection in the darkened window. The man staring back looked lighter. The shadow over Seoul had finally dissipated, leaving behind someone who was ready to stand in the sun. The glass doors of the arrival terminal slid open, and for a moment the bustling chaos of Incheon Airport seemed to fall into a profound, expectant silence. Adrian stood at the edge of the crowd, no longer flanked by a phalanx of guards or shielded by the tinted windows of an armored sedan. He was just a man in a simple coat, holding a small bouquet of jasmine. The scent Maya had told him reminded her of home. When she emerged from the gate, she looked different, yet exactly the same. Her braids were pulled back, her posture was regal with the confidence of her success in London, and her eyes still held that fierce, uncompromising light. When she saw him, she didn't run. She walked toward him with a steady, purposeful grace, as if every step was a choice she was making in real time. "You stayed in the light," she whispered as she reached him, her voice thick with emotion. Adrian pulled her into his arms, the familiar warmth of her presence grounding him more than any empire ever had. "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," he murmured against her hair. Later that evening, they stood on the rooftop of his penthouse, the same place where they had once defined the boundaries of their worlds. Below them, Seoul sparkled like a sea of fallen stars. The city felt peaceful, no longer a chessboard for his maneuvers, but a home. Adrian took her hands in his, looking at her with a seriousness that made the air feel still. "When you first met me," he said, his voice a low, honest gravel, "I was a man people feared. I lived in a world where power was the only currency." Maya nodded gently. "And now you're a man people respect. You chose to be better." Adrian shook his head slightly, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "I want to tell you the truth about how it all started. I told you I was doing a favor for Minjun, that I was just filling in for 10 minutes because he couldn't make it." Maya looked at him curiously. "Wasn't that the case?" "Not exactly," Adrian confessed. "Minjun didn't miss that date because he was busy. He set the whole thing up for me. He knew I was drowning in the shadows, and he thought if I met someone who saw the world differently, I might find a reason to come back to the surface. He wasn't looking for love for himself. He was looking for a soulmate for me." Maya let out a soft, surprised laugh, her eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "So the devil was set up." "The devil was saved," Adrian corrected softly. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "I didn't just find a partner in that cafe, Maya. I found the person who reminded me that I had a soul worth saving. You weren't a favor I was doing for a friend. You were the choice I had been waiting my whole life to make." They stood there quietly, not rushing the future or forcing the next chapter, simply grateful for the journey that had led them from a 10-minute lie to a lifetime of truth. A feared man had chosen differently, and a brave woman had believed he could. It was the end of the deception, and the beginning of everything else.